They spit on her, cut her hair, and tied her to the hitching rail. Then a rider said, "Let her go or die." The sun bled itself thin against the edge of the world, staining the horizon a deep, sorrowful red as dusk settled over Absolution's Rest. The land, once a hopeful stretch of fertile promise, had turned brittle with years of drought and grief. Dust clung to the bones of dying trees, and wind swept down the empty main street, lifting skirts of sand and ash like restless spirits. A single rider approached, her silhouette a dark smear against the dying light. Horse and woman moved as one weary shape, the animal's hooves kicking up muted puffs of dust on the hard-packed earth. Her name was Ada Mercy, though no voice in that town would speak it kindly. A tattered shawl draped her head and shoulders, edges frayed and darkened by smoke and long travel. Beneath it, her face bore the quiet, unyielding lines of a woman long acquainted with sorrow. The townsfolk saw her coming long before she reached the first hitching post. Figures stiffened by doorways and behind streaked windows. The blacksmith's hammer stilled on the anvil. A boy running along the street slowed, then vanished between buildings. Women gathering wash-off lines made crosses over their chests. The town was small enough that no stranger passed through unnoticed, and this was no stranger. The name came in whispers, like a splinter beneath skin. Ada Mercy, the widow, the half-blood, the cursed. Years had passed since she'd ridden away from Absolution's Rest with nothing but a grieving heart and a bleeding palm. Fire had taken her husband, her child, and the home built with blistered hands and blind hope. And though time moved as slow and cruel as tar in this place, memories of shame and blame held fast. As she guided her mare down the main road, the wind carried with it the heavy scent of approaching rain, the clouds swollen and dark in the west. Thunder rumbled low, a sullen growl beyond the buttes. The animal beneath her twitched its ears, uneasy. At the far end of town, the saloon crouched like a weary, sour-tongued old man. Its sign hung crooked, swaying on rusted chains. Lantern light bled from the warped windows, and the sour clink of glasses carried over the wind. She drew rein, dismounted, and tied the mare loosely to the post, though she knew no one would dare steal a cursed woman's beast. Her hand, still bearing the jagged scar across the palm, brushed the animal's neck in passing. Inside the saloon, every eye lifted as she pushed open the door. Floorboards groaned beneath her weight. The room smelled of sweat, stale whiskey, and old resentment. Men huddled at tables or leaned against the bar, voices dying mid-word. A brittle silence fell like frost. Ada didn't flinch. She'd walked through worse in her years away. Murderous stares, stones thrown at her feet, words meant to break what little spirit hunger and cold hadn't already taken. She moved to the counter, her voice steady though her throat ached from thirst. "Room for the night," she said. The barkeep, a thick-shouldered man named Royce Craddock, spat into a dented tin and wiped his mouth with the back of a grimy hand. His beard was more gray than black now, but his eyes hadn't softened with time. "Ain't got none," he grunted. "Full up." A lie so thin it barely bothered to hide its ribs. No one else spoke. Ada's gaze flicked to the far end of the room. A pair of ranch hands smirked over their cards. The preacher's wife, Maud Tillman, sitting stiffly by the hearth, twisted her mouth and turned away. Even the old mutt by the stove let out a low whine and crept beneath a chair. She left without another word. Dust and gathering mist clung to her shawl as she stepped back into the street. The air tasted of iron and earth, the sky heavy and bruised. The town's one inn, a sagging two-story frame house, with half its windows boarded, bore a single lamp in the window. But the keeper's wife, seeing her approach, snuffed the light and shut the curtain. Ada's jaw set tight. She led her mare to the livery, its wide, yawning doorway empty of life. No stable hand in sight. A lantern hung from a nail, guttering in the wind. She left the horse with what feed she could spare and carried her meager bundle, a rolled blanket, a tin cup, a small, rusting pistol, to a narrow alcove beneath the eaves of the livery. The wind picked up. Dust scuttled like dry leaves. The first drops of rain struck the earth, darkening patches in the dirt like old blood. Somewhere to the south, a coyote's cry cut the gloom. She settled against the wall, knees drawn up beneath her shawl. The rain soon turned steady, drumming on the tin roof above. The town's lights dimmed as shutters closed. The storm would pass by morning. They always did. But what didn't pass was the ache beneath her ribs, the echo of small hands that would never again clutch her skirts. The memory of the man whose laugh once filled a cabin now returned to ash. The emptiness of her name when no voice would call it. And yet, Ada Mercy had returned, because sometimes the land you are born to, the grave of your kin, and the house your dead will claim you tighter than the hate of men ever could. She watched the rain bead along the brim of her hat and thought, they don't have to forgive me. I only have to outlive them. And somewhere, beyond the hiss of storm and dust, thunder grumbled its low, mournful approval. The night settled over absolution's rest like a heavy, wet shroud. The storm did not rage so much as linger, a relentless drizzle punctuated by distant, rolling thunder. Rain tapped against warped window panes and guttered against the eaves, a sound that mixed with the soft shifting of old wood and the huff of restless horses in the livery. Ada Mercy sat alone by the back wall of the stable, a battered tin cup cradled between her palms. The coffee inside was little more than boiled grounds and rainwater, the bitter taste clinging to her tongue. But it was warm, and warmth in this town was a rare commodity. She watched rivulets of water snake down the livery's outer wall, gathering in a shallow rut where mud thickened and turned black as coal. The scent of wet earth, manure, and old timber mingled in the damp air, carried on a wind that pressed cold fingers beneath the hem of her shawl. The town had gone quiet, as it often did when the sky turned angry and the night grew thick. Lamps dimmed, voices hushed. Folks here believed darkness could listen, and so could the past. The scar across her palm itched in the damp. She turned her hand in the weak glow of a lantern hung from a rusted nail. The mark was jagged, puckered where the blade had bitten deep. Years ago now, but no less vivid. A line drawn between the woman she was and the one who remained. She remembered the night it happened, not the fire, though that had come soon after, but the day her world was peeled apart like a green branch split at the heart. Back then, the name Mercy meant something in this town. She was the sheriff's wife, a woman with the smell of fresh bread in her hair and the sound of a child's laughter in her home. A braid down her back thick as rope, dark as river stone. She kept a rifle by the hearth and whispered stories in a tongue she'd learned at her mother's knee. Songs about hawks and rivers, about the bones of the earth. No one asked then where her mother had come from, only admired her cooking and the herbs she tied in bunches above the stove. Until the raid. A band of painted riders came through one autumn evening, leaving smoke and blood in their wake. And though none could say for certain who had guided them through the narrow pass, it didn't matter. Grief had no need for reason, fear even less. When the cries had quieted and the wounded were buried, someone remembered the songs Ada sang, the feather charm hung by her doorway, the curve of her cheekbones too sharp, too foreign. It spread like fire on dry grass. A whispered word, savage blood, a curse in the veins, superstition soaked deep into the marrow of old frontier bones. They came for her in the night, faces she knew, twisted by drink and terror. Royce Craddock with his butcher's hands, Maud Tillman's thin lips curled in satisfaction. A rope looped about her wrists, yanked her from her home while her husband lay cooling in the ashes of what used to be their parlor. They cut her braid first, thick, dark hair falling in handfuls, clinging wet to her skin. Someone spat in her face. Someone else called her ghost blood, a witch, a curse sent to finish what the raiders had begun. They tied her to the hitching rail outside the saloon, left her there as the night turned cold and the sky threatened storm. She bled from split lips and a wound in her palm where a careless knife had slipped. And then the stranger, a man no one spoke of after, though every soul in absolution's rest remembered. He stepped from the dark with a battered Stetson pulled low, his coat ragged and the stock of his rifle worn smooth by time and war. He didn't shout, didn't bluster. His voice came low and steady, a sound like distant thunder rolling over the plains. Let her loose, or bury your dead. And in that moment, they knew he meant it. None dared raise a hand. Craddock went pale as bone. One by one, they turned away. A knife severed the rope, and Ada fell into the mud. When she looked up, the man was gone, his shape swallowed by rain and darkness. She never learned his name, never saw his face in the light, but the memory of that voice, of the quiet weight of it, lodged in her chest like a thorn too deep to dig out. Now, years later, she traced a scar across her palm with a thumb, a rough caress over old pain. The town hadn't changed. Men still spat curses behind her back. Women still pulled their children close. They hadn't forgotten, and they hadn't forgiven. But she wasn't here for their forgiveness. Her last claim to dignity, a faded deed to her family's homestead, left buried in the town's records, waited somewhere in Royce Craddock's possession, and she would have it back. No matter how long the night stretched, no matter how many doors shut in her face, a gust of wind rattled the livery's loose boards. The horses stirred, their bodies shifting in the dark. The storm still grumbled on the horizon, but its fury had lessened, the rain falling softer now, a mournful lullaby for the lost. Ada finished the last bitter swallow of her coffee, set the cup aside, and drew the shawl tighter around her shoulders. Some wounds bled beneath the skin. Some names clung longer than the dead, but she was still here. And in absolution's rest, survival itself was a defiant kind of grace. The storm came down hard, thick sheets of rain hammering the rooftops and muddying the narrow streets of absolution's rest. Lightning split the sky in jagged white cracks, illuminating the warped timbers and sagging porches, the old saloon sign swinging wildly on its rusted chain. Thunder followed a breath later, a heavy, bone-deep sound that seemed to make the earth itself tremble. Ada Mercy rose from her lean-to beneath the livery's eave, pulling her shawl tight against the wind's sharp teeth. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth, manure, and wood smoke, though the rain washed much of the dust from the streets in heavy rivulets. Her mare, restless in the weather, shifted in the lean-to's makeshift stall, stamping a hoof against the muck. Ada stepped into the rain. It struck her face like cold nails, soaking her shawl and dress within seconds. She moved through the slurry of mud and standing water toward her horse, intent on slipping out of town come dawn. If the storm broke by morning, she'd ride for the hills and sleep in the open before she'd spend another night with this town breathing down her neck. She reached for the mare's reins, and a hand clamped around her wrist. The voice came next, slurred by whiskey and venom. Well, well, if it ain't the ghost blood herself. She turned and met the leering face of Clem Craddock, Royce's son. His teeth were yellowed, his skin pocked with old boils and new scars. The rain plastered his lank hair to his face, making his eyes gleam like wet stones. Behind him, two ranch hands loitered, their clothes soaked through, the stink of sweat and spirits radiating off them in waves. I told him you'd crawl back someday, Clem hissed. Sniffing after what ain't yours. Ada tried to pull free, but Clem's grip was iron. One of the ranch hands stepped in, grinning wide. Look at that, boys. Braid's growing back. The words hit her like a fist. Ada's hair, long and dark as riverbed stone, hung in a thick, rain-soaked braid down her back. A quiet rebellion, one she'd tended for years. A symbol of what they'd stolen, and what she refused to let die. And now, in this storm-soaked street, the past came calling. Clem reached for the braid. Ada struck first, raking her free hand across his face, nails catching skin. He cursed, staggering back. The other two moved in, boots splashing in the mud. A knife appeared, a thin, cruel thing that caught the flicker of lightning. Hold her, one spat. The rain came harder, and in the flash and noise, Ada's heart pounded like a war drum. She fought, her fists flying, feet kicking against shins, but they were too many. Cold hands yanked her shawl from her shoulders, exposing the curve of her throat and the mark of old bruises, a map of history the storm could not wash away. The blade found her braid. One swift jerk, a sick sound of fibers parting, and the hair fell heavy into the mud. The years collapsed into a single, suffocating moment. It was the same hitching rail, the same foul, drunken voices, the same stench of sweat and rain. She tasted copper in her mouth, a mix of memory and now. They dragged her through the muck, toward the post. A flash of lightning split the world open, and in its wake, A shape appeared at the edge of the storm. A rider, motionless, silhouetted against the black sky. Horse and man alike cloaked in shadow, water sluicing off a wide-brimmed Stetson, the faint glint of a rifle stock resting across the saddle. For a breath, no one moved. Then Clem, emboldened, brandished his knife. "This ain't your concern, stranger. Keep riding it." The figure did not move. Another jagged flash lit the street, casting deep hollows in the stranger's face, though it remained half-hidden beneath the brim. One of the ranch hands snorted. "Full soaked through. Can't even see straight in this storm." The man in the saddle lifted his rifle, the barrel, long and worn, leveled at Clem's chest. The voice came then, low, steady, carrying through the rain, and the rumble of thunder like a prayer whispered to a God no one dared name. "Let her go or die." It wasn't shouted. It didn't need to be. Ada's breath caught in her throat. She knew that voice, not by name or face, but by the way it folded time. It was the same voice that had cut through another storm-soaked night, years past, when she'd hung by her wrists on this very rail. Clem's grin faltered. The ranch hand shifted, nerves setting in. "Who in hell were you two?" "I won't ask again." The hammer cocked with a sound sharp and clear above the storm. In the charged hush that followed, the town itself seemed to hold its breath. A window shutter cracked open somewhere. A horse whickered nervously. Clem hesitated, then stepped back, throwing Ada's severed braid into the mud as though it burned him. The other two followed, slipping away into the dark like cowards before a storm they could no longer control. Ada straightened, blood on her lip, hair clinging to her face. The rider gave her a long, unreadable look. The lightning caught the sharp lines of a scar along his jaw, the glint of worn iron buttons on his coat, and then, without a word, he turned his horse toward the edge of town. Ada stood in the rain, chest heaving, and watched him go. Time folded in on itself. It was him, the same man, the voice that haunted her nights and her grief. Some debts, it seemed, waited years for their reckoning, and some shields, once raised, were never fully lowered. The storm had slackened to a steady curtain of rain by the time Ada swung herself up behind the rider's saddle. She said nothing as he led them out of Absolution's Rest, past the shuttered windows and darkened stoops, down a narrow wagon trail slick with mud and memory. The hooves of his horse splashed through standing water, and the only sounds were the soft creak of leather and the relentless hiss of rain on the chaparral. The rider didn't speak, nor did he glance back at her. The wide brim of his hat kept his face in shadow, and in truth, Ada was grateful for the quiet. Her lip was split, the ache in her ribs a dull, stubborn thing, but it wasn't the bruises that gnawed at her. It was the feeling of being dragged once again toward that hitching post, the stench of old hatreds clinging tighter than her sodden clothes. They rode until the town's lamps were no more than flickers, swallowed by the mist. At the edge of a copse of wind-twisted trees, a sagging structure emerged from the dark. An old chapel, its steeple half-collapsed, the weathered boards gray as bone. The cross above the doorway hung askew, one side splintered. The rider dismounted and helped her down, his grip firm but not unkind. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of wet timber, dust, and old hymnals left to decay. Pages littered the floor like yellowed leaves, curled and brittle at the edges. A cold hearth waited against the far wall. With practiced ease, the rider struck a spark, coaxing a small, stubborn fire to life. It took to the dry kindling with a soft sigh. Ada settled onto a bench near the flames, drawing the damp shawl tighter around her shoulders. Her braid, or what remained of it, lay in the mud somewhere behind them. Her hair hung loose now, dark and clinging to her neck. He crouched by the fire, fed it another piece of dry wood, and at last spoke. "Name's Cutter," he said. "Eli Cutter." The name settled heavy between them. She knew it, not from some ledger or memory of the war, but from the way the town had once whispered it, low and bitter. A hired gun in the years before the war, a man who rode where coin called him, then vanished, a man with blood on his hands and silence in his wake. Ada eyed him in the flickering light. His face was lean, lined with old battle, a scar running from the hinge of his jaw to the hollow of his throat. His left leg favored the fire, his right stiff from an old wound, the limp pronounced when he moved. She could see the outline of a battered Union belt buckle in his palm, thumb moving over its worn brass surface like a man polishing a worry stone. "Gettysburg," he said, by way of explanation, his gaze still on the buckle. "Didn't leave whole." Ada touched the cut on her lip, the split skin tender. She wasn't sure why she spoke next, but the words came of their own weight. "They cut my braid," she murmured. Cutter glanced up. His eyes were sharp, a gray the color of storm water. "I saw." A long silence stretched. The fire cracked and hissed, throwing uncertain light across the chapel walls. The rain drummed steadily on the tin roof, 1,000 tiny nails. In one corner, an old hymnal page lifted and settled in the draft. Ada lifted the chain around her neck, drawing forth a tarnished wedding band. The metal caught the firelight, though it no longer gleamed. She turned it in her fingers, buried him with the rest, out on Mercy Ridge, burned the house after. Cutter nodded once. His jaw tightened. "I was here that night," he said quietly. "Didn't stop it." He trailed off, as if words cost more than he could afford. Ada's eyes flickered toward him. "You made him untie me." "I should have done more." The words hung there, brittle as old bone. She felt the weight of her own resentment rising, bitter as the old coffee she'd swallowed hours before. Resentment at needing rescue, at still being a woman men thought they could drag through the dirt, at still having a place in this world only because some other man drew a line. But another part of her, smaller, quieter, remembered the night's raw terror and the voice that split it apart, a voice that had spoken for her when no one else had. She let the ring fall back beneath her shawl. "I don't need saving," she said. "I know." Another log settled in the fire. Sparks drifted up toward the high beams. The chapel was a ruin, but in that ruin there was still warmth, still dry ground. Two figures sat in the glow, one limping, one bleeding, both carrying ghosts. "I came back for the land," Ada said, her voice steady. "There's a deed, buried somewhere in Craddock's things. My father signed it before he died. I mean to see it in my hand." Cutter took a long breath through his nose. "They won't give it up easy." "They don't have to," she replied. Cutter's lips tugged in what might have been the start of a smile, or the ghost of one. He tossed another splinter of wood onto the fire. "I'll ride with you in the morning." She studied him, the lines in his face, the weary set of his shoulders. There was no offer in his words, no soft edge, just a fact stated plain, like the storm outside or the fire between them. Ada nodded once. "You limping all the way, old man?" His chuckle was low, a sound like gravel underfoot. "Likely." The fire crackled. The rain eased to a whisper, and in the hush neither spoke again, but the distance between them, long and ragged as it was, began to draw in. Some souls were too battered for easy words, but a shared silence, if held long enough, could be its own kind of shelter. By the time dawn broke, the storm had wrung itself dry. What lingered was a cold mist, curling in low pockets along the ground, shrouding the trees and broken fence posts like old spirits reluctant to leave. The land smelled of wet earth and scorched pine, the air cool against the skin. Inside the chapel, the fire had dwindled to a bed of coals, its glow a muted, weary thing. Smoke hung in the rafters, clinging to the warped beams like a memory. Ada sat cross-legged on the floor, her shawl draped about her shoulders, watching Cutter break apart, dry kindling with hands marked by years and war. The silence between them had settled into something less sharp, the kind of quiet two people could occupy without needing to fill. "Storms broke," Cutter said at last, feeding a few sticks into the coals. Ada gave a soft nod, her hair hanging loose about her shoulders now, damp but clean of blood. A small stain darkened the corner of her mouth, where the split lip had scabbed over. She ran a hand through the tangle and let it fall. It felt strange, the absence of the braid. That first one had been hacked away with a blade and malice. She'd grown it back out of defiance. This one hurt differently. Cutter reached into a worn satchel, produced a small pouch of cornmeal and a dented tin of lard. With movements unhurried and sure, he mixed a meal with a bit of water from his canteen, working it into a rough batter with the side of a knife. "Where'd you learn that?" Ada asked, her voice rough from disuse. Cutter's lips twitched. "Woman I knew in Texas. Died in a fever. Never quite figured the right amount of salt." Ada watched him shape the crude dough, press it flat onto a hot stone near the fire's edge. The smell of cornmeal warming over embers filled the chapel, soft and strange in its gentleness. It spoke of kitchens long abandoned, of mornings where bread rose in iron skillets and coffee boiled over. "Seems a long road from here to Texas," she murmured. "Road most of it," he replied, settling back on his haunches. His gray eyes found the dying fire. "After what they did to you, I left. Couldn't stomach this place. Rode east when the war came. Wound up in blue because it paid better than gray. Thought maybe killing a few worse men would balance the ledger." Ada's gaze drifted to his leg, the way it stretched stiffly before him. "Did it?" "No," his answer came with a tired smile, the kind that spoke of old failures too familiar to hurt anymore. "You can bleed a man dry and still be thirsty." She made a sound, low in her throat. Not quite a laugh, not quite a sob. Just a thing shaped by years of empty rooms and barren winters. "I buried my husband on Mercy Ridge," she said. 2 days later, my boy. Dug their graves myself. Burned what was left of the house. Folks said it was the curse. Me. That if I left, the land might heal." Cutter was quiet a long while, the fire crackling between them. "They're fools," he said. "They were afraid." He nodded. "Fear makes men cruel." Another silence fell, but it was softer now. Outside, a jay called once, sharp against the hush. The mist was lifting, revealing the broken fences and the empty stretch of prairie beyond. The cornbread crisped along the edges. Cutter flipped it with his knife, the scent rising. He cut it in half, handed a piece to Ada without a word. She took it, warm against her palm, crumbs clinging to the skin. They ate in silence. When it was gone, she reached for his coat, where it lay over a splintered pew. A long tear ran along the left shoulder, the seam split. She produced a small needle from her pouch, a thing so old and bent it might have been passed through generations, and began to stitch. "You don't have to," Cutter murmured. "I know," Ada said. The rifle leaned against the wall, its barrel catching the dawn's first light. The chapel smelled of wood smoke and cornmeal, the dying fire breathing the last warmth into the chill. When she finished the seam, she set the coat aside. Cutter picked up the Union buckle, turned it over in his hand. "Never figured what peace was supposed to look like," he admitted. "Maybe it's not a thing you find," she said softly. "Maybe it's what you build when there's nothing left." Their eyes met, gray storm to dark river, and in that exchange something wordless passed. Not forgiveness, not the mending of old wounds, but the understanding of shared ache, the stubborn will to endure. The fire sighed its last and fell to ember. Outside, the mist had thinned. The world smelled clean in the aftermath. Cutter stood, his limp pronounced, but steady. "We ride at first light," he said. Ada nodded. She gathered her shawl about her shoulders, brushed a hand through her unbound hair. A lock fell loose against her cheek, shorter now but defiant in its presence. They stepped into the pale dawn together. Some fires burned bright and brief. Others, banked low, can smolder through the coldest nights. And between them, something had caught, a flicker in the ash. Dawn came in shades of ash and pearl, the storm's ruin trailing behind in streaks of mist. The world held its breath as the sun pushed pale light across the prairie, touching the warped timbers and sodden earth of absolution's rest with reluctant grace. Eli Cutter rode in alone. The mare's hooves struck soft against the mud-thick street, his rifle slung across the saddle horn, its barrel worn smooth by years of restless hands. No crowd gathered to meet him. This town had long ago learned to fear a lone rider with death in his eyes. But doors opened, curtains twitched, faces crept to windows like moths to a flame. They couldn't help but watch. The saloon loomed ahead, its sign hanging crooked, chain links still slick with rain. Outside, Clem Craddock and 2 of his kind stood half-drunk on last night's whiskey, belly still bloated with bad intentions. Their faces paled at the sight of Cutter, their boots suddenly too tight in the mud. Cutter reined in, dismounted slow. No bravado, no showmanship, just the steady scrape of boot leather on wet earth, and the long shadow of a man who'd buried too many brothers to waste words. He let the silence stretch until even the wind seemed to hold back. You. Cutter pointed a long, weathered finger at Clem. You first. Clem's mouth worked, but the words caught. He reached for the knife at his belt, but the twitch was a coward's reflex, not a fighter's claim. Cutter leveled his rifle. I spoke one warning already. You heard it. The tension bled from Clem, like a pop blister. He let the knife drop, its edge biting into the muck. His throat bobbed, face sickly and pale. Drop to your knees. Clem obeyed. The other two shifted, uncertain. Cutter turned his gaze on them, one by one. You raised a hand against a woman tied to a post. A woman alone. That stays with a man. Follows him to the grave. No one answered. The preacher arrived then, drawn by whatever justice still clung to the marrow of this place. Old Elias Mercer, his hair gone to silver, his Bible thin as a blade. Cutter nodded once. Law belongs to you now, Mercer. The preacher's face was carved from years of funerals and droughts. He said no sermon, no prayer, only stepped forward and laid a hand on Clem's shoulder, steering him toward the jailhouse with a grim set to his jaw. The others followed, heads bowed not from guilt, but because they knew something had shifted in the bones of absolution's rest. And there was no going back. Cutter turned and walked to the saloon doors. Inside, Royce Craddock waited, sweat beading his brow despite the chill. His face sagged, the years and drink and venom pooling in the pouches beneath his eyes. He fell to his knees before Cutter reached him. Please, Royce rasped, his voice a thin, wheezing thing. It weren't me. It wasn't my hand. It was your town, Cutter said quietly. You let it fester. You sold the rope they hung her with. Royce's face crumpled. Cutter didn't raise his rifle. Didn't need to. He turned instead to the back room, where a rusted tin strongbox sat half buried beneath ledgers and debt slips. From it, he withdrew a folded parchment, yellowed with age, the ink smudged but legible. The deed. Ada's name in a man's uneven script. He tucked it into his coat and left without a word. Outside, the town stood hushed. Some part of it knew this morning was different than the ones before. The air was clearer, the road ahead long, but no longer thick with storm. He rode out toward the edge of town, where Ada waited astride her mare. She wore a fresh braid, short and uneven but stubborn in its defiance. It caught the dawn light like a dark banner, a line drawn in the sand between what had been taken and what remained. Cutter handed her the deed. She didn't smile. It wasn't a moment for smiles. But her hand brushed his in taking it, and the weight of that small contact said what words would only sour. Where you headed? She asked, her voice as rough and steady as the land itself. South, he said. Don't know how far. Ada nodded. I'll ride as far as the Mercy Ridge Fork. Good enough. Two figures on horseback, the dust rising in their wake, the town shrinking behind them like a bad story told to frightened children. No promises spoken. No debts named, only the road and the pink smear of morning on the horizon. They passed the old hitching post, the rope long gone, the wood grayed and splintered by years. Cutter slowed, reached down, and left his rifle leaning against it. Ada raised a brow. You sure? He met her gaze. Some burdens best left behind. She nodded once, understanding in her bones. Together they rode on. Two weathered souls against a wide, unclaimed sky, leaving behind a gallows of memory and the storm-bleached bones of absolution's rest. The braid caught the dawn, and somewhere ahead, the land waited,